Well, what other factors?
Yeah, isn't that strange?
Induces AIDS in people if it's not infectious.
Yeah, you've got another key point. If you have this viral load, and this is really true that these things are not infectious, then how can it cause damage to your body? It can't actually. It's sterile. A virus that's not infectious is like a dead virus. If you want, well, it might not be dead, but it doesn't do what viruses are supposed to do, which is go in and cause problems in your cells. In any case, that's enough for that one. Next page is the low CD4 counts and a multifactorial model of AIDS, where I go through all these. This one I really enjoyed writing. This one ended up being really long, way too long. I would have to cut this down to 1/10 the size to get it published. And essentially, the first paragraph sort of states it. Low CD4 T lymphocyte counts, or CD4 counts, are associated with a variety of conditions, including viral infections, bacterial infections, parasitic infections, sepsis, tuberculosis, coccidioidomycosis, burns, trauma, intravenous injections of foreign proteins, which means IV drug use, essentially, but also hemophiliacs getting all the treatments all the time that they get. Malnutrition, over-exercising, pregnancy, corticosteroid use, normal daily variation, psychological stress, and social isolation. So there's all these studies out there of low CD4 counts. And you might say, well, but they're not as dramatic as the ones in HIV and AIDS, and that might be true sometimes. You do get people, I remember at one point there was it was through email, and it was a guy, so a conversation between some people who were HIV positive about their, that someone shared with me. And one of the guys responded that his CD4 count was 1, which is of course quite low. Normal is something like, let's say, 600, 700, 800 per milliliter. It's really, I think, 1,000. But whatever, it doesn't matter. The number given is 1. And so this guy made a joke, and he said, well, you know, actually I'm doing quite well, so that one must be really doing a good job.
What a hilarious attitude.
That was a good attitude, wasn't it? But anyway, so that maybe that's extreme. I would argue that it's not necessarily, though, proof of anything. In these studies, for example, in pneumonia, I use that as an example in the third paragraph there, they just took people with pneumonia who were HIV negative. So these are not people HIV positive, not people diagnosed with AIDS, people diagnosed with just pneumonia. 30% of them had CD4 counts less than 200. And as I say here, in someone diagnosed HIV positive, a level below 200 is considered a sign of extreme immunosuppression caused by HIV. No one questions it. And because of their low CD4 count, they would be started on several antimicrobial medications, that's anti-fungal medications and antibiotics, because it's considered their immune system wouldn't be able to protect themselves. So it's just automatic. Even if you're healthy, no pneumonia, just a low count that low, they say, all right, we're starting on Bactrim, and there's some antifungals that they'd be started on too. And also they'd be started on antiretroviral therapy, which I call protease inhibitors and DNA chain terminators. Let's see here if there's something else I could comment about that. And then I comment, sort of the major argument of my paper is that if you were to combine a lot of these things, if a person, which is true in many people diagnosed HIV positive, that either they're already sick before they get diagnosed, because that's why they got tested. Somebody comes in the hospital badly ill and they're fairly young, there's a chance they get tested, especially if they fall in the risk groups, which tend to be considered in our society as unclean too. So there's a tendency to sort of say, okay, this person is a drug user, let's test them for HIV. But if somebody who comes in who's sort of wearing a tie, they're unlikely to be tested for HIV, even if they have the same illness. Just for the record, you know, there's this problem with all the testing that you have.
May I ask, if they say we're going to test for HIV, and there's so many false positive tests, is there a standard methodology that's being used, or a variety of methodologies?
For how you test for
For
HIV?
testing, yes.
There's pretty much one that comes from the labs that make the tests. They tell you how to do it. And no one really knows how many are false positive. And I don't claim to know either, but I am more suspicious than most. And there are a number of studies which at least make you suspicious, put it that way. And you mentioned some, the issue of isolation, but there's also, for instance, the test relied on really heavily for the diagnosis is the Western blot test. You have a preliminary test, which is a screening test, and then the confirmatory test, which is the Western blot test. But if you run the Western blot test on, again, the general population, a lot of people have an 20 to 40%. That's a very high number. Indeterminate is not positive, I grant you that, but it still makes you a little bit jittery. It made me jittery when I read it, and that's one of the many studies that I sort of came across that led me to say, you know, let's try to find what's going on here. Is it a real test, or is it a good test or not? And I was willing to actually look things up. There's another thing, the argument here, that if you have many of these problems, you could have really low CD4 counts. Pneumonia by itself does that, and the levels don't come up right away when you're better. It may take months for them to come back up. It takes a while for your system to go back into a regular balanced state. So that's what that paper's about. Let me see if there's something else that I can comment. It also goes through some other things, just general talk about what it means, what this means, that this, everyone used to think that low CD4 counts were specific to HIV and AIDS in the initial days, and a lot of people still do. But people who know, including most infectious disease specialists, know that actually it can be lowered by all these other conditions. I don't know if any of them were as thorough as me to look up all these studies and, you know, write a 25-page paper with, you know, at least 100 of them that I read. But nobody faces that. The initial people, the reason they even hypothesized that HIV was causing AIDS was because they found it in CD4 cells. So the whole thing was really predicated on the CD4, low CD4. The first thing they found was low CD4 counts. Then they said, listen, something must be killing these CD4 cells. That must be it. And then they started looking in these CD4 cells and found HIV in some of them. Or at least surrogate markers for HIV, meaning antibodies, which isn't in the cells, but they found them in people's blood. In any case, it gets to be a big mess when you go look into it. That's what I would say, and I sort of uncover some of that here in this long, lengthy paper, in addition to going through study after study of all these different conditions causing low counts.
This sounds like somebody comes to the park and says, oh, look at the dog droppings, and somebody else says, no, 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 those are raccoon droppings, and somebody else will say, no, 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 that is, the droppings that are found in the cells are ambiguous. The markers. Nobody can put their finger on it and say it is or it isn't.
I think that's true, although most conventional people would get upset by the thought of it, let alone admitting that it might be true. There was something else I was going to say about this before we left it. I can't remember. Let's go to the next one.
Do you think there's too much money involved in this for people?
It's not only money. There is,
Glory.
you know what I call it? I call it a societal belief system. And I go back to Copernicus. Many people call people who question today's belief systems flat earthers, if you would. But you could turn the tables on them and go back to Copernicus and Galileo after him, who were the people that, you know, looked at the skies and said they didn't think the world was flat, and they thought also beyond that that the stars and planets were not rotating around the Earth. You know, in other words, that the sun. It really came down. Copernicus was saying the sun is the center of the solar system, and that was a blow. But he was not threatened. He was ignored and ridiculed. That's all that happened to Copernicus, as far as I know, unless some of you guys know better than me.